was an integral part as vice president. Respect for sovereignty and rule of law were the constants. But much has gone wrong between the US and China since then. So, adding to this complexity of US China relations under Trump administration, first and foremost was the pandemic. The origins of COVID 19 were assigned to China. Then we saw the Hong Kong protests, the Xinjiang minorities issues, the 5G wars, the trade wars, and much more. But I foresee that in response to the US plans for deployment of intermediate range missiles in Asia Pacific, there will be new threats created and symmetrical responses generated by both China and Russia. Pakistan does not figure into this fight and cannot be used as a proxy to oust China, akin to the ousting of the Soviets in the 80s. So that's my first point about South Asia not being the epicenter of Sino US rivalry, which, broadly speaking, lacks the characteristics of the Cold War, since the reality of armed combat between the two in the Asia Pacific is too obvious to be blinded to. My second point is about the reshaping of the world order. Behavior of the US and China will shape the contours of regional and global geopolitics. The course that this great power duel takes will depend upon a number of factors. Two among them deserve deeper understanding and analysis. One, how will both countries construe non kinetic security threats and put them alongside the kinetic ones in the security mosaics? Two, how will both countries handle their allies and partners during and after the pandemic? The security element will assess how likely conflicts can be in the post pandemic world, and relations with allies will be instrumental in ascertaining on whose side the balance of influence will hang. So, from what is apparent so far, it could be reasonably argued that the two heavyweights will look at crises like COVID 19 through the lens of security and think of them as blow to their proxy power mixes. The responses thus will lead to competition and conflict rather than competition and cooperation. As far as relations with their allies are concerned, China and US will tread different routes. While China would find this pandemic as a fillip to its efforts towards economic integration, the US will likely opt for a muscular recourse, even under a Biden administration. All this does not augur well for the post pandemic world that we live in. The pendulum will likely swing more towards conflict, and that's unfortunate. Washington's preparations for a response mechanism to China could pretty much be seen through the lens of deterrence and compellence. This brings me to my third and last point about US relations with India in the context of Sino US strategic competition and its effects on Pakistan. Indo US strategic partnership has US China rivalry at its heart. There is no doubt about it. Is the US using India to counterbalance China in the Asia Pacific region? Yes. Renaming of US Pacific Command to US Indo Pacific Command in 2018 signaled the importance of the Indian Ocean in US strategic thinking, overlapping with US strategic interests in the Pacific, and India fits the bill for the US to enhance its security architecture in the region. For India, why is US important? We have seen that India's resolve and capability was severely tested against China in the Galwan Valley skirmishes. In response to 20 soldiers killed by PLA, no retaliation came from India. Had this happened with Pakistan, we all know how this would have gone down. With China, India has limits, and those limits were visible to the entire world earlier this summer. Now, while India sells its China threat well to the US, this is one complementarity between the two, leading them to resolve their differences, which we have seen has led to signing of BECA, giving New Delhi access to US satellite data, which is critical for targeting missiles and other military assets. India, there, furthermore, will continue to remain a major defense partner for the US under the Biden administration, just like it was under the Obama administration, where New Delhi will be allowed to buy more advanced and sensitive technologies from the US to counter China. Therefore, as long as India continues to keep the China threat alive, it has significant advantages to reap with the US. So, what does it mean for Pakistan? While India has found its anchor in China, which it paints as aggressive and threatening to the US led world order, Pakistan, because of its geographic proximity to the two countries and due to the presence of US as an extra regional force in our region, is directly affected by this power mix and cannot escape the friction. Can Pakistan maintain low profile with respect to how US China rivalry plays out in the region? Answer is a mix. It's a both yes and a no. Yes, in a sense that Pakistan will not be asked to choose one side over the other, and Pakistan too should have the clarity not to allow its relationship with China be seen as a zero sum by the US. And as long as that clarity remains, India will not be able to exploit that situation. And no, in a sense, that agreements like BECA, which allow India to utilize critical satellite data on Chinese military formations, will also expose Pakistan related data to the Indians unless the US explicitly assures Pakistan that its data will be isolated and not shared. However, it is hard to trust countries, and Pakistan should not be naive enough to have such an expectation from the US. If it serves the US interest to use that as a leverage with Pakistan at a later time, then why wouldn't the US want to retain that leverage and give it up just because Pakistan is asking to? In this case, it will be hard pressed for Pakistan to keep low key and not safeguard its strategic interests by joining hands with China or other friendly countries in the region to counter the strategic consequences of Indo US defense cooperation. So, for now, the situation is a mixed bag. There are consequences for US led US Indo actions against China in the region, in which I see Pakistan clearly gets caught. One can only hope that the region move towards cooperation rather than confrontation. And if this pandemic has taught us anything, one critical lesson is that we all are in it together. And great power politics can only go so far in ensuring survival and security of its allies and partners across the region. I'll stop here and I look forward to the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Abia. That was interesting. I'm sure it will raise many questions. And I see lots of students, they have signed up in today's webinar, and they might have questions. I also welcome Dr. Brigade Feroza. Thank you for joining us. We know that it's quite early morning, rather midnight, one can say. Thank you very much for making this effort. Our next speaker is Ms. Elizabeth Thurutgill, and she will be speaking on Afghan peace process, prospects and challenges. Ms. Elizabeth is a senior fellow and deputy director of South Asia program at the Stimson Center. Before joining Stimson, she served as a foreign service officer with the US Department of State in Islamabad and Peshawar. She has additional work and educational experience in China, Taiwan, Turkey. Ms. Elizabeth holds an MPhil in politics and international relations from University of Cambridge. In her dissertation, she analyzed political and security dynamics driving the development of governance reforms in Pakistan's western border region. Her research interests include South Asian geopolitics, ethno-nationalist conflict, and territorial disputes. She is the recipient of Department of State Superior Honor Award, several meritorious honor awards. She speaks Pashto, Mandarin, and Spanish. Ms. Elizabeth, floor is yours, please.
Thank you so much for that kind introduction and for the invitation to join you all this morning, my time, this evening, your time. It really is a pleasure. As we were saying before this kicked off, one of the perhaps few benefits of the pandemic is that I'm able to beam in from Washington, D.C. So really have appreciated the discussion so far and looking forward to learning from my fellow panelists in the Q&A. So I have been asked to gaze into my admittedly cloudy crystal ball and think through what prospects await for the Afghan peace process, particularly in the context of a transition of power from the Trump administration to the incoming Biden administration. I should say at the outset, this is a time of transition. And so I will do my best to assess where things are going, but I'm going to try to focus today more on the structural dynamics that I see as really underlying the situation right now. So I'll start by giving my thoughts, my assessments on where we are right now, what has happened in Afghanistan, What are some of the factors that we should be paying attention to? I'll then transition to speak a little bit more depth about those structural challenges. So, what are the underlying issues, the negotiation dynamics that I think, regardless of which administration is in power in the US, will continue to drive the action, so to speak, in Afghanistan? And finally, I will look at prospects under the Biden administration. What changes, what remains the same, and what it might mean going forward. So, I think right now, in terms of where we are, this is a time of great uncertainty all around. We have been watching with great interest here in Washington the news about the expected troop cuts the Trump administration is looking to implement in the last couple of months that they have in office. This is still a moving target. The most recent reporting, open source that we've seen, suggests that it might be around that, getting down to the 2,500 number, which National Security Advisor O'Brien had previously forecasted. So there was some discussion that it might be a full troop withdrawal in the next 2 months, but it seems like those reports might be a bit overblown, and that we're looking at something like going down from 4,500 to 2,500, which is not insignificant, but I think it's perhaps causing some to breathe a sigh of relief in terms of the extent of the cuts that we can expect. Fundamentally, though, all sides are seeking clarity on what the approach of the incoming Biden administration will be. That means the Afghan government, the Taliban, regional players, certainly. So there's still a lot of questions up in the air at this point. And I should also mention that any transition from one administration to another during negotiations is difficult and is fraught, right? Negotiations, just as much as they center on substance, also really depend on things like personal relationships and the rapport that's been built across the table, and trust. And to the extent that the team under the Trump administration has been able to develop that sort of rapport over the past 18 months or so that they've been working to drive this deal, that is something that could be difficult to replicate and build on in a short period of time. So that's another dynamic to keep in mind going forward. Now, in terms of the response to the current uncertainty that we're seeing, it seems like all around groups are hedging, engaging in hedging behavior, trying to protect their interests regardless of how the situation is going to turn out. And that can have some difficult unintended consequences. So as we've seen really from the outset in September, the talks that are ongoing in Doha between the Afghan government and the Taliban are stalled. Neither side seems likely to make any sort of real concessions or progress until the US role is clarified, right? It's kind of a wait and see mode right now in the way that it was in the run up to the election. Now that seems to be extended, although perhaps as we get a little bit more clarity from the incoming administration, that could start to change over the coming months. Meanwhile, violence levels have been reported to be up by 50% in Q3 over Q2. So in the last 3 months, it's been clear that the Taliban seems to be seeking gains on the battlefield in the meantime, while the talks remain stalled. And so what that has led to is a dynamic of, you could call it contingency planning, where we're seeing continued reports of internal power brokers within Afghanistan, as well as regional players, are seeking to kind of strike their own deals to protect their interest in the event of an abrupt US withdrawal. So it's a very conservative posture in a way, not looking for a great deal of progress at the negotiating table, but trying to cover one's own bases in the event that things really do go south in Afghanistan. And that's a challenging dynamic in which to try to engage in difficult negotiations that will require compromises from both sides. And that's the challenge of the current moment, is how you transition from this kind of moment of hedging and uncertainty and provide a bit more structure and clarity going forward, that will build momentum behind the negotiations. Before I get to how the Biden administration might fare in that process, I do want to unpack what I see as kind of the fundamental structural challenge for the US in these negotiations. And that is the US has to speak out of both sides of its mouth to a certain extent. So simultaneously, it needs to try to convince the Taliban that the US is staying until and unless they comply with the terms of the Doha deal and make progress at the negotiating table. That's on the one hand. On the other, the US needs to try to convince the Afghan government that the US is leaving so that the Afghan government can take the negotiation process seriously and also work through some of the internal challenges that have come about through the current Ghani-Abdullah setup. So those are two different messages to convey to two different audiences at the same time, and it's really difficult to do both of those convincingly. I would argue the Trump administration was successful in showing the seriousness of their plans to withdraw, but really failed to hold the Taliban to account in the process. So it might have been more successful in showing that the US might head to the exits at any moment, but hasn't necessarily taken that next step of showing the Taliban that they need to comply with the conditions of the Doha Agreement in order to achieve that US exit. Again, that is really a tightrope to walk, but it is the tricky underlying structural issue of these negotiations. And when you hear about the current challenge they're running into when both sides are arguing over whether the Doha deal or the US-Afghan joint declaration should be the basis of talks, that is to a certain extent what's being discussed. So moving on finally here to what this means for the incoming administration and future prospects, I think overall I expect more of a change in tone and process rather than in substance. So many of the underlying structural issues will remain the same. The prevailing desire to end forever wars will remain, along with the desire to refocus on great power competition, what the US views as competitors in China and to a lesser extent, Russia. So that will be more or less a continuous focus from the Trump administration to the Biden administration. How that plays out, though, is really a question. Obviously, both sides are jockeying for their own position. We've seen the Taliban call for continued adherence to the Doha Agreement, while there seems to be hope within Kabul that a Biden administration will bring a bit of a reprieve from the immediate withdrawal pressure. I think the Biden administration will have a brief window of opportunity when it comes to power in which it will need to communicate both its expectations of both sides and its intentions in order to try to re-motivate these talks to get them off the ground. The question of what happens with troop levels between now and then is significant. I would say that if they are reduced to the 2,500 number that we now expect, military experts I've spoken to who know more about these issues than I do have indicated that the US will be able to maintain a limited counterterrorism function with those numbers. It won't be as robust, particularly in terms of training and assistance to Afghan forces, but it's not a zero figure either. Going forward, we have seen some indications that as opposed to the deal that was inked between the US and Taliban in Doha, President-elect Biden has hinted at wanting to seek a small counterterrorism-focused troop presence in Afghanistan going forward. That was not included under the Doha Agreement. But by the same token, the Taliban has also not complied with their own commitments in that agreement to break ties with Al-Qaeda and other terrorist groups, according to UN reports. So there's a question of whether the new administration will adhere to the Doha Agreement or seek some renegotiation. My sense, based only on open source and what I've been able to gather, is it is likely to attempt to move forward with negotiations as is, but to be more sure about trying to hold the Taliban accountable for the increasing violence levels across the country. As I mentioned, that is a difficult thing to do, but there is a sense that the Trump administration has essentially let the Taliban get off scot-free without a great deal of pushback. I think beyond the troop issue, though, going forward, one issue to focus on that could determine future prospects is the question of financial support. To my mind, this does not get enough focus, and it really could be key in terms of leverage, because as opposed to troop levels, which the Afghan government seeks to maintain and the Taliban seeks to give up or seeks to have a US withdrawal, financial support is something that I suspect both the current Afghan government and the Taliban would be interested in under a future power sharing agreement. And so it's important to watch what happens with funding levels, for example, at the upcoming donors conference that we'll see in Geneva in just a couple of days. So in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic, obviously economies around the world are struggling. And so the question of how much continued financial support will go to support the Afghan government, the Afghan security forces, is a very important one, and one that can provide the US with leverage in addition to things like troop levels. That gets much more conversation. I think lastly, it's important to also remember that the Biden administration has called for a renewed focus on diplomacy, economic statecraft, versus defaulting to military deployments overseas. But those are linked issues because in Afghanistan, for example, embassy officials and other civilians do require a base level of security to operate. And so if we are to see a full US troop withdrawal and the security situation deteriorates, that would call into question the effectiveness of embassy presence, diplomats on the ground, and could be a real challenge going forward. So all that on the ledger, I think we are likely to see more of the same to a certain extent at the negotiating table, but it's really incumbent on the incoming Biden administration to take advantage of that window of opportunity and to try to use it as a reset to clarify their intentions, clarify their expectations, and try to build a bit of momentum that really has been lacking in the talks over the past several months. Obviously, patience will be key in this process. Negotiations of this type are never easy or never short. But overall, I expect more of a change in tone and process rather than substance going forward. Thanks so much, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Afghanistan has always been a complicated issue. Predicting future of Afghanistan is even more complicated. I'm sure many participants will have questions. So once again, all those attendees, if they wish to ask questions, they can start writing in the question answer session window. And the speakers can also, if they want to respond one-on-one, or we can collect those questions towards the end and then we can discuss. So from Afghanistan, we'll now move to Middle East. Our next speaker is Dr. Nazir Hussain, who will be speaking on the topic of Middle East in the search of new identity. Professor Nazir Hussain did his PhD in political science from Bahauddin Zakir University, Multan, and postdoc from French Institute of International Relations, Paris. Dr. Nazir was previously director of School of Politics and International Relations, Qaid-e-Azam University, and a faculty member at the Department of Strategic Studies at Qaid-e-Azam University. He's a former visiting fellow Henry L. Stimson Center, Washington, D.C., and at the Institute for Political and International Studies, Tehran. He has authored 2 books and over 45 published papers to his credit, among various other achievements in the academic field. Dr. Nazir Hussain, sir, floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Mr. Vice Chancellor, Air University, and Dr. Adil Sultan for inviting me and giving me an opportunity to share some of my very stray thoughts. And good evening to my Pakistani participants, and good morning to the participants from North America, especially to Brigadier Feroz and Ms. Elizabeth. After a long time, I'm seeing the face of Brigadier Feroz. He is quite young still. It's very lovely to see him after a long time. Adil, I'm sorry, but my CV is halfly written. I'm currently Dean Faculty of Social Sciences, and I have more than 80 research publications to make things updated. Anyways, my analyses are basically not structured. It's a very straight thoughts, but I believe on two things. One, that Mr. Biden has a lot of executive and foreign policy making and other experiences, 40 years, almost 10 years with Mr. Obama, and then of course he's been senator and various members of the House committees of the U.S. Congress. So he has a tremendous experience, and with experience, it comes also the responsibilities. He would not be behaving like Mr. Trump, tweeting to fire his Secretary of Defense. So he'll be more mature, more experienced, more diplomatic, and more forward-looking president if Mr. Trump agrees to give him the power. Secondly, it won't be a 360-degree turn. I believe as a student of international relations, it will be continuity and change. Continuity in some aspects and change in some aspects. It is very surprising. Two statements have occurred. One statement emerging from Prince Mohammed bin Salman. Still, Mr. Netanyahu has not greeted Mr. Biden. He has not spoken to him yet. And secondly, the incumbent, the coming acting Secretary of Defense, probably 2 days ago, in his testimony to the House Committee on Foreign Affairs, probably has said, time to come home, meaning thereby that for the last 4 decades, the US troops are in Middle East. So it's time to come back. There are various reasons. I think the people with the background of military, like Brigadier Feroz and Air Commodore and Dr. Adil Sultan, can understand the war fatigues and family issues and other things. So it's 40 years, and nobody can understand the price of peace than a soldier. So I think there are some movements going on whereby the United States of American troops, as Ms. Elizabeth was saying, especially in terms of Afghanistan, from 10,000, 12,000 to just 2,500. So it will be like, I presume and expect that it will happen because United States of America is so much entangled in Middle East, Iraq, and Centicom, and Saudi Arabia, and Syria, and Yemen, etc., etc. So I think there is going to be some not structural, but some changes. The one fundamental change which I expect as a student of Middle East, especially, that Iran would be welcoming the incoming of Mr. Biden, because through his speeches while his election campaign, he has categorically stated that he would like to have not renegotiate the treaty, but renegotiate the terms of reference of the Iran nuclear deal. So I think we are expecting, and please, as an academic, I must say that the policymaker in United States of America, especially at the State Department and the Pentagon, must understand that Iran is a major power in the region, geopolitically speaking. Otherwise, so it will not be altogether important to altogether ignore the Iranian influence and Iranian stature in the Middle East. So it's good that a mutual cooperation, coexistence would prevail between Iran and the United States of America. And I think the Iranians in their heart and mind are happy that Mr. Trump has gone and Mr. Biden is coming. So I'm seeing a welcome hope of Mr. Biden and of course, his team to come into power and have a window of opportunity of renegotiating the Iran nuclear deal, not the deal itself, but coming back to the terms of, because all my friends and colleagues, they understand that Iran nuclear deal is not a bilateral deal between Iran and the United States of America. It's a multilateral deal, and of course under the auspices of the United Nations Security Council. So it is good for both Iran and United States of America as well as for the Middle East. The second thing which I understand is through the statement of Vice President elect. She has said that we would like to have dialogue and negotiation with the Palestinians, because during the Trump time, the Palestinians were put to the wall. Uh, in fact, they had no opportunity to discuss, debate. In fact, more than one around $900 million aid to the Palestinians were cut off by the Trump administration due to various reasons. So I'm seeing a window of opportunity also, because we cannot ignore the Palestinian. They are the people, though without proper state structure, but we cannot ignore. And of course, we can understand the stances of different political leaders in Israel. But the two-state solution has been agreed by the Arab League, by the United Nations Security Council. So it will be good for the Palestinian also, that a window of opportunity is opening, because as we all are related to the security issues, if you put the people through the walls and there is no negotiation room left, there is no space available. So then, of course, the only chance recourse is the violence and the war and the conflict. So I think there is also a great window of opportunity, that if the dialogue is opened up between the Palestinians and the United States administration, it will be a good omen for the overall Middle Eastern security structure. The last thing which I would like to have is Mr. The Prince Mohammed bin MBS. He has been skeptical after Biden coming into power, because Mr. Biden has very categorically in one of his statements has stated about the killing of Mr. Khashoggi, the Saudi journalist. But of course, we all understand that the election rhetoric are different than the actual policy making once you are in the White House, and of course your national security advisor, different lobbies are working it. But I think there will be some breaks to Mr. MBS ambitions in the Middle East, because he has been playing in Syria and Iraq and Yemen. So it will be difficult now for him to go free hand in the Middle East. And of course, with this, we come to some continuity and some changes in the Biden administration. We are also expecting when the Secretary of State is chosen, who's Secretary of Defense, that will also make a very important contribution towards understanding Mr. Biden as his team in the foreign policy opening and approach to the United States of America. But my last comment is that no 360-degree changes. It will be continuity in some aspect. And of course, a new administration after 4 years in power of the Republicans. Some of the aspects which I believe from Obama administration into Biden administration, because that will be also a factor of continuity. And of course, the special policies of the Democrats has been promotion of democracy, non-proliferation, and other aspects which will be predominantly going there. Last comment is that we have to see between November and January what happens, because I've been reading a lot of scary news in the New York Times. Mr. Trump intending to do this and that. I don't want to discuss that. I hope and pray and wish that those things do not happen, although the Pentagon has totally refused to prevail, to give this idea to Mr. Trump. Then in the last days, what he wants to do. Hopefully, things will be better. Mr. Biden's coming into power is a good omen, presumably for the Middle East and, of course, for the world. Just last word, Sultan Adil, that is the major challenge to Mr. Biden, not in the Middle East, but overall would be to win over the confidence and the trust of the United States of America by its allies, whether they are allies in as Pakistan, or they are allies in Middle East, they are allies in Europe. because the style of Mr. Trump was very, very different than he was totally unexpectedly doing things through tweet. But Mr. Biden would be more experienced, as I said, more mature and more responsible in dealing with his allies and, of course, in different regions, especially in the Middle East. Thank you very much.
Sir, thank you very much. And my apologies, I cut short your CV. Actually, I know you so well. I thought everybody knows you very well, but that's not the reason. My apologies for not updating my record and the CV that I had. That was an old one. The last one that you said about this New York Times recent report about the possibility of a strike on Iranian nuclear facility. During question and answer session, I would like you to speak on this because there was a reference that during Bush Jr.'s last days, they did carry out that Stuxnet attack on Iran. So people are thinking there could be a possibility now also, and what would be its implications for the region. But now let's move towards final panelist, Brigadier Feroz Hassan Khan, who is a research professor at the Department of National Security Affairs, Naval Postgraduate School, Monterey, California. He will be speaking on the future of arms control under the Biden administration. Brigadier Feroz is a former brigadier from the Pakistan Army with experience in active combat on the line of control in Kashmir and Siachen Glacier and Afghanistan border. He has worked on numerous assignments in the United States, Europe, and Asia. He served as Director Arms Control and Disarmament Affairs in Pakistan's Strategic Plans Division. He had been a key contributor in formulating Pakistan's security policies on nuclear and conventional arms control and strategic stability in South Asia. He produced recommendations for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and represented Pakistan in several multilateral and bilateral arms control negotiations on peace and security in South Asia and international treaties related to weapons of mass destruction. Brigadier Khan holds an MA in International Relations from the School of Advanced International Studies, Johns Hopkins University, Washington, D.C. He has held a series of visiting fellowships at various U.S.-based institutes. He also taught courses as a visiting faculty at the Department of Defense and Strategic Studies, Quaid-e-Azam University, Islamabad. He has widely participated in international and national conferences on strategic issues, international security, terrorism, nuclear arms control, and non-proliferation related issues. He has published a book titled Eating Grass, The Making of the Pakistani Bomb. Brigadier Feroz, sir, your turn, please.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Okay. Good morning.
Sir, loud and clear, sir.
Assalamu alaikum. Very good morning from California. Good evening to everyone. The future of arms control during Biden administration. I've been thinking since Adil talked to me about this subject. This was one very unique campaign this year in which there was no serious issues that was put on the table of the kind that you would usually have in campaigns during elections. Elizabeth, correct me if I missed something out there. These issues on arms control and issues about foreign policy, etc., were seldom discussed during the kind of debate that we have had here. This is a very different time. So it's very hard to say what situation we are in. So we're talking about prediction and we are going about what had happened in the past and what has been happening recently, and then we're going to predict from there. So I'll be very brief here because I'm more interested in the Q&A from you. So very briefly, I would say that we have seen that in the last 20 years, particularly, since last 20 years, that the era of arms control was pretty much on the back burner. When the century began, the first thing that happened was that the Bush administration absorbed the ABM treaty. That was the beginning of arms control, of a kind of a reversal of that. Because until that time, when the new century began, India and Pakistan had conducted the nuclear test, and we were under tremendous pressure about CTBT, about FMCT, about strategic restraints, about missile restraints, etc. And we were coming out under an era where we were debating between how to enhance deterrence and how to to sort of forge arms control. The two sides of the coin, the deterrence and arms control. Those debates that we have been learning as students were actually applying as a newly acquired nuclear weapons power in the first 5 years of our. I'm talking about the first 5 years when we saw the first element happening of ABM treaty going in 2002. Then we saw over a period of time is that the INF treaty. Uh, well, we could blame Russia on that. Russia started putting in some ground-based system, and it was a matter of time. And then INF treaty went away. Then we saw very recently what President Trump did was the Treaty of Open Skies. And the debate that has been going on throughout the year has been about whether the current administration would renew the New START or not. One of the hope was that if the Biden administration comes, one thing that would happen is that the New START might have another lease of life, which we are expecting. So that is one thing that we could say. The other aspect that the Biden administration is expected to say, and I was hoping Dr. Nazir Hussain would have said that, but he probably alluded to that. It is quite now looking that the Iran JCPOA deal might have a new lease of life, and that would change the dynamics as to what has been happening in the region. So apart from everything that he said about Middle East, by the way, I have nothing to disagree with anyone in this panel. We are all sort of complementing each other. So one of the things for Biden administration would be whether he thinks about reviving INF treaty to embrace China into the process. Because what we are looking at the future of arms control now is, at least it's very difficult to wrap your head around, because in essence you are saying arms control in an era of great power competition. In our lifetime, we have only seen great power competition as two bipolar systems there, and then there was a unipolar US system. Now we are seeing multipolarity, and that is one of the examples that will there be an INF treaty that would embrace China into the discussion. And if that is the case, you can see at the background where I'm speaking, where there's little, it's called the Jeju Forum 2020. Actually, I was speaking just about a couple of days back, and that has not gone away. But actually, I was speaking on the same subject here on this forum, where they were asking about what could be the INF treaty future. And the discussion was that if the INF treaty there has to be a bigger Asian INF treaty, and that might include India and Pakistan encompassing with that because of the trilateral nature of problems that Rabi Akhtar had so very, we are the confluence of three nuclear powers here. So anything that happens in Asia, the three nuclear power confluence is at this part, and this has to be very differently thought about, in my view. So these are some of the things that I could think of that the Biden administration would think of. Now, one another way to look at it is Biden administration going to pick up the same where the Obama administration left? That's the most common thing being thought about. So let me just go back to where we were in 2016. But when the Trump administration came, all those things went away. It was kind of fizzled away. So the Obama administration's stress was throughout their period. I mean, other than the Prague vision that he gave and the New START he gave, was on nuclear security summits. And that was a big emphasis during his time. During the Obama administration time, there was a significant push of bringing India into the nuclear supplier group, which is where a very intense negotiation was going on between Pakistan and United States, and separately with India and United States on this issue. So what were those issues at the time that could be picked up again, if at all those issues are relevant? And I do not have any reason to say whether they will be picked up, because things have changed a lot in the last 4 or 5 years. So there were essentially 4 issues on which there was bilateral US-Pakistan issues. And those issues were essentially the nuclear world order issue, where Pakistan's quest for legitimacy was at the root of the discussion that was going on with the Obama administration. And by that, what I mean was the 3 outlier states of the NPT, Israel, India, and Pakistan. But with Israel and India being given special status, which we all know, it was a position as to where was Pakistan lying in that order. And that is where the discussion about the nuclear supplier group and other export control regimes became very important at the time. It was surprising, at least at the time, that was noticed that Pakistan was only interested in one of the four export control regimes, that was the nuclear supply group, had no interest in the other three. And ironically, India was a member of the other three, and this whole fiction was of NSG. That's one question whether or not that push will come up again or not. But now, in an era of great power competition, it is very hard to see that China would probably act the same way as it acted in 2008 when it came to the Hydeck passage and through the 123 agreement, if you remember all those days. I doubt that that issue will go anywhere unless and until there is a broad, greater negotiations of the kind. The second issue was about nuclear stability issues, and that nuclear stability issues revolved around the lowest end of what the arsenals, what the Pakistani arsenals were. That was the tactical nuclear weapons. Uh, the lowest level was the 60 kilometers, Nasser, and the highest demonstrated range was Shaheen 3. And that was a discussion that was at the time to have some kind of a framework for the US to keep on supporting Pakistani NSG membership, although the US was not explicitly committing to that. The third issue was nuclear security and safety, which was manifested in the four security summits and many of the NTI indexes that you saw. And I think from a Pakistani standpoint, this was one area where the Pakistanis came out very well on these issues, because I think the maximum amount of work in my assessment and most of the assessment of my colleagues is Pakistanis did a tremendously good job on the nuclear security regime. And finally, about the nuclear energy, which of course was again linked to the NSG, which was not going anywhere. So that is the kind of discussion that could happen again if the Obama administration, Biden administration comes back and picks up where Obama administration had left. Not too sure about those issues, but that is what I would be thinking, is that the best that could happen. So it's kind of a mixed bag on these issues, but almost certainly the Democrats and the Biden administration will have much more closer to these issues that I mentioned, these 4 or 5 issues, compared to what the Trump administration had. So that's all I can say about the future of arms control. I do not see any revolutionary discussion on CTBT or FMCT or any of those issues really coming up at the time. So that's about all, The great power competition, we are trying to see more of an arms race here rather than arms race stability, rather than we are seeing prospects of arms control very, very weak these days. So I think I'll stop here. There's not much for me to say. I'll be very happy to answer questions.
Sir, thank you very much for your remarks. We do understand it's quite early in the morning and you made an effort to be part of this discussion. I'm sure there would be many interesting questions. So first I'll go to some of the questions raised by attendees, and in the meanwhile I'll also add some of my questions to generate that kind of discussion. This question is from Ms. Sifat. How would the Pakistan-Afghanistan relations impact in the wake of US-led NATO forces withdrawal from Afghanistan, and how could India's hegemony be curtailed in the region in the wake of withdrawal of US-led NATO forces from Afghanistan? Elizabeth, I think you're one expert over here, so I'll direct this question to you. And also, keep into mind the recent dossier that Pakistan has released, in which there are apprehensions of Afghan soil being used by India, creating instability against Pakistan, and with solid evidences. So those are apprehensions really in this part of the world, especially in Pakistan, that if US troops, in the presence of US troops, if this was all happening, what will happen if US withdraws? So how do you see that post-withdrawal, if it happens, how the situation will evolve?
Sure, thanks for that question. In terms of Afghanistan-Pakistan bilateral relations in the wake of a potential US withdrawal, I think this is a really important issue and one that frankly doesn't get as much attention as it should. The dynamics are quite interesting at the moment. We've seen repeated high-level bilateral visits in a way that we haven't for quite some time. Most recently with Dr. Abdullah coming to Pakistan and Prime Minister Imran Khan now rumored to be traveling to Afghanistan this week, actually. So some progress on the bilateral front. But simultaneously, we're also seeing ongoing firing across the Duran line with Pakistan's border fencing efforts, and some tensions there that are popping up locally. And so I think that will be a difficult issue for both sides to manage. But overall, I am optimistic about prospects for Afghanistan-Pakistan relations in the wake of a withdrawal. I think it is an encouraging sign that we're seeing these high-level visits, and notably, this was one issue that actually came up in the US-Afghan joint declaration that was signed simultaneous to the US-Taliban agreement. The US agreed to facilitate talks between Afghanistan and Pakistan. That process, as I understand it, is ongoing to a certain extent, but it seems like really the bilateral momentum between both sides is building. The question going forward in terms of a potential US withdrawal and what that means for Pakistan's interests is really comes down to stability in my mind. If we do see some sort of an abrupt withdrawal and unfortunately things move to more intensified conflict, all out civil war, I think I would be very concerned if I were Pakistan about the prospects of cross-border movements of refugees seeking to escape the violence in Afghanistan. And as we've seen in some recent incidents, particularly with the border fencing now largely in place, it raises questions about how that movement of people will be managed. I know there is a great deal of sensitivity within Pakistan about the Afghan refugee community. And again, Pakistan should be commended for having hosted previous generations of Afghan refugees. But I think it is very much in both countries' interests to try to manage that challenge while anticipating it. The recent tragic incident that we saw with the Afghans who were seeking visas and the stampede that came about was just one reminder of how difficult it can be to control movements of people and to ensure everyone's safety, particularly in the middle of a pandemic. And so that applies both to Pakistan, certainly with the traditional ties across the border, but also to Iran potentially. So that could be one major consequence we might see. With regards to India's position, I recognize those concerns within Pakistan, but for what it's worth, when I speak to colleagues in New Delhi, I think there's a feeling that India is not actually well positioned in Afghanistan these days. India has, to a certain extent, relied on the US security umbrella, and there is fear within India that in the event of a US withdrawal, that some of the same terrorist groups that India believes are operating within Afghanistan will have more room to operate, essentially. It could potentially target India as a result of that. And so the threat perceptions on both sides actually seem to be mismatched at this point. And I think there's a sense within New Delhi that perhaps, as we've seen, they're being encouraged to reach out to the Taliban and establish more ties. But there's not a great deal of confidence about what India's future prospects in terms of its security imperatives in Afghanistan look like. And so I think that will be a dynamic to watch, but perhaps it's worth keeping those mismatched threat perceptions in mind, given the broader strategic dynamics of the region.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Another question, there was a question by Mr. Mozam Dar on which Rabia has responded, and he had a follow-up comment also. But I would like to ask this question to Dr. Rabia also. In relation to the question asked by Mozam Dar, America and China are now conducting their diplomacy in confrontational way. Is there a palpable danger that surprises will occur, which will go beyond rhetoric into actual military conflict? You have answered this question, but I want to link it to a statement made by Henry Kissinger today that the United States need to open its communication channel immediately with China to avoid any disastrous consequences. So, do you think any other country, especially Pakistan, which has past played that role of mediatory between United States and China for opening up the communication, is there a potential for Pakistan to play that role given the hostile environment? I would like you to respond to these, please.
All right. Thank you so much, Dr. Adil. So, with respect to Kissinger's statement, I think he's feeling nostalgic. He was right at the heart of the opening up, with China, and Pakistan was central to it. And that's what I say. Pakistan needs not choose a side. There are no sides here. And I'm very clear that neither China nor the US would push Pakistan to choose a side. So if Pakistan plays its cards, cleverly and balances out both the United States' interests in the region and, conveys it to the US that it is still in the position to act as a conduit for communication with China, then I think its profile, within the incoming Biden administration would definitely increase. And I think Pakistan needs to have that, centrality on its side. And I'm pretty sure, with the kind of diplomatic finesse that we have at this point, the security establishment is already thinking about as to how and what role can Pakistan play in bringing both these together. And if there has to be a rapprochement between US and China, then Pakistan can play a central role in that. If you may allow me, there was a question posed by Shah Rukh Khan Achakzai about arms control, and I told him that Brigadier Feroz was very clearly answering his question at that point in time. I would just like to add one more thing to that. I don't foresee US going back to INF because of the kind of developments that are happening in the unmanned combat aerial vehicles that earlier INF treaty did not allow US to develop and use. So we've seen that INF prohibited deployment of ground-launched cruise missiles with ranges between 500 kilometers to 5,500 kilometers. Um, Israel had developed and used earlier in the 90s an unmanned combat aerial vehicle which acted as a cruise missile, had a 32 kg warhead and range up to 600 kilometers. Due to INF restrictions, these UCAVs could not be used as cruise missiles, but now outside INF treaty, nothing stops US to develop these unmanned combat aerial vehicles and use them as cruise missiles. So that is one area which is now open, and I don't foresee that US would go back to the INF treaty, even if China was willing and ready to be a party to it, which it would not be. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Abia. There was a question which probably the person who asked the question, he removed it, but that was interesting thought, and he's my student also, so that's why I'm raising the question. To Dr. Nazir, Ikram Mullah, he asked a question that last time United States and Iran, they had a deal. On the side effects were that there was a greater turmoil in Middle East. So if the new Biden administration goes for that kind of a deal again, what will be the future of Middle East in that context? So, but I'll also link this to my earlier comment, Dr. Nazir, that I asked. I would appreciate your comments on these. On the New York Times story on the possibility of a strike on an Iranian facility. Plus, there was a report today by Al Jazeera where Saudi minister has once again said that they will build nuclear weapons in case Iran develops nuclear weapons. So, if you would like to answer these three issues collectively, I'll be grateful. Dr. Nazir, sir.
Thank you, Dr. Adil. In fact, all three questions are interrelated. I think already people in Washington and United States of America would be bearing me out while discussing Iran. Uh, I read two articles, one by Palok and the other by Prokovich back in 2015, living with the nuclear Iran. So there are already so many academic discourses on Iran going nuclear in somehow or the other. But for me and my belief, as Brigadier Feroz has also said the same thing, that a new lease to the Iran nuclear deal, if Biden comes, and there are welcome signs from both the sides. So at least if the nuclear deal is on for the next 15 years, Iran is not going to go nuclear in any way. But if Mr. Trump, in his last days of administration, does something extraordinary to strike on Iranian nuclear plant at Bushehr, not possible at Fordow and other areas because those are very deep into Iranian territory. And anyone who is well versed with Iranian geopolitics would be taking 1,000 times to consider that such a radius time, and especially Dr. Adil, being you, being the fighter pilot, a 3,000-kilometer radius from the state of Hormuz to deep inside Iran would be a very, very difficult task to strike. But anyway, Bushehr can be an easy target. And if, to my belief, this is my belief since very long time, if the Bushehr is ever attacked by any power in the world, whether United States of America, Israel, or any Arab states, Iran would not take any time to go nuclear. This is my belief, a very firm belief. So I think it would be visible, prudent on the part of the U.S. administration, especially the Pentagon, to persuade Mr. Trump in his last days not to do this suicidal mission. And then the consequences would be very, very severe. We can understand the Iranian proxies all over the world, especially in Middle East, and all U.S. targets, both civilians and well as the combat would be at the target, and this would be a new war which nobody can stop. This would be societal, I must say, for both the parties, both the states, and as well as for the Middle East. And I wish and presume and say that it should not happen. And the last paragraph of the New York Times also states the same thing, that the Pentagon has advised not to do this. But after having said this, I think Iran is ready, and Iran is in their heart and mind, Iranian leadership in their heart and mind are welcoming the coming into power of Mr. Biden. And I have just written to the answer to the question raised by Kramullah. Please try to understand, we all are students of international relations. United States of America, whether you like it, whether you don't like it, whether you accept it, whether you don't accept it, United States of America is the superpower of the world. Nobody can deny it. It's militarily very, very powerful. Nobody can deny this. It has an outreach of unimaginable consequences. Yes, of course, we can disagree on economic issues, on political issues, and diplomatic issues. That's a multipolar world. But on military terms, United States of America is an unimaginative military power, military might in the world. In the same coin, Iran is a regional power. Nobody can deny this. And I've been talking this a long time, since 2004, while I wrote my piece of paper on Iran as a regional power. Because the geopolitics of Iran determines its future. It is surrounded by mountains on three parts, three sides, so nobody can attack, or neither Iran can attack. And of course, the geopolitical understanding of the Persian Gulf, 1,500 kilometers coastline from Shatular to the Strait of Hormuz, is an immense geopolitical powerhouse. So I think it will be good for both Iran and the United States of America to try to live with each other. It's been 40 years for the new Iranian regime. There have been many, many instances by the United States of America to undo the revolutionary regime of Iran, like regime change and Greenpeace and throwing off of Mr. Ahmadinejad and so many other things. But it has not, in fact, it had it has proved counterproductive. Iranians have become more hardliner. The hawkish elements in the Iranian leadership have become more anti-Americans. So I think it will be a window of opportunity if both the United States of America and Iran under Biden and of course the Hassan Rouhani. And by the way, Adil and Feroz, they know very well that Hassan Rouhani had been the chief negotiator of many nuclear issues between the United States of America and Iran. He was the Secretary General of the Iranian nuclear establishment previously for a very long time. So he's a very unlike very other hawkish element. He's a very prudent. He's a very practical person like Hashmi Rafsanjani and Mohammad Khatami. So there is a window of opportunity, and I think I take this as an opportunity that Mr. Biden is coming to power, and the Iranian would be welcoming it, and it's a chance. The history can be written that if there's a new lease, to use the words of Brigadier Feroz, the new lease to the Iranian nuclear deal, it will be good for all, believe me, for all the Middle Eastern states and especially for the world. And it will also restore the confidence of those nuclear aspirants who would like to become nuclear, that no international treaties are abided by, they are given credence. And it is not unilaterally that you sign a deal and of course, if this deal is coming through, then of course, I'm not relating it to North Korea, but definitely there is an element of no confidence, mistrust between the American U.S. leadership and the North Korean leadership, because the trust deal is very much important. So I think Mr. Biden's coming to power would be a good omen for Iran and United States American, not relations, but approach towards each other, and of course for the Middle East at large. Thank you, Adil.
Sir, thank you very much. Before I come to Dr. Rabia again for a question asked by Mr. Farooq Ansar, I'll go to Brigadier Feroz. Sir, you have talked about the likely agenda or the interest of the new administration. Nuclear security was one major issue in which Pakistan and the United States have been engaging in the past under Obama administration. So, do you think that it will be one of the area of interest for the United States next administration to re-engage with Pakistan on this issue, or there's no more interest? Second, the recently concluded BICA agreement, Basic Exchange Cooperation Agreement with India, United States, India, one of the 4 foundational agreements. So there has been lots of talk in Pakistan about its negative implications on strategic stability, because many view that now the complete satellite imageries and signal intelligence, that kind of information will be shared by the United States to India, and that will provide better situational awareness to the Indian military planners to plan surgical strikes like they did in 2019, or maybe through drones. So how do you see that, the impact of these agreements on strategic stability? And finally, you have been involved in Track 2, and you have been part of several dialogues where India and Pakistani interlocutors, they were there, and the United States as a third party that facilitated. Keeping in view the growing trend in India that they do not want to engage bilaterally with Pakistan, and they want to bring in or drag China into this kind of an arrangement. Do you think are there any prospects for such kind of Track 2 dialogue between India and Pakistan, and where the United States is the facilitator? So if you could kindly address these three issues, sir. Thank you. Sir, your mic is kindly unmuted.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the question, if you have noticed that during the Trump administration, the only strategic dialogue that the two governments had at the official level was on Afghanistan. There was not any broad-based discussion, to the best of my knowledge. The issues about those issues that were discussed during the Obama administrations were probably not the priority list during the Trump administration. So the first question that you asked was that at the time when the Obama administration was going, there was a strategic dialogue going on at 2 levels. There was a dialogue led by White House, Peter LeBoyer at one hand, and then there was State Department by Dr. Rose Gotwala. These were the two streams that were in continuous discussion with Pakistan on host of issues, including NSG membership, including nuclear security, and all those things. Those four things that I mentioned. So yeah, so my sense is that there may be some kind of a strategic dialogue process that will begin between Pakistan and United States that includes that spectrum of discussions that was probably left behind 4 years ago. And I would fully agree with what Rabia had said earlier on about the implication of BECA and what you just said in your question. I mean, that's just understood what's happening. But if I recall, she also said that unless US assures us that those agreements will not be shared uh, to the detriment of Pakistan's security. Now, the only way you can determine that is to reach out to the US and commence a negotiation dialogue. In my view, both at track one as well as track two level. And it is never a good idea that if track one level discussions are not going on, you should also shut down track two. In fact, track two becomes even more important when things are not going well at the official level, at the one level. If things are going fine at the official level, you really don't need track two. Track two can be just kind of complementing here. But a gridlock on bigger issues, track two is the only way that it can really diffuse tensions. So, United States is very keen. One of the key objectives of the US, regardless of administration, is to ensure stability between India and Pakistan, prevent crisis and war between two nuclear armed countries, especially in South Asia, because I think US has specific interest in India and specific interest in Pakistan. And the last thing they want, India and Pakistan crisis, the last thing they want to manage an India-Pakistan crisis. That's the last thing anyone sitting in the White House would even want that. So yes, whether it is track two level or track one level, whichever, United States, in my view, and Biden administration will perhaps be taking more initiative to push both sides towards a dialogue. This absence of dialogue between India and Pakistan, I would say that probably President Biden will be coming down on Mr. Modi to reconsider his policy towards Pakistan. They're not going to isolate Pakistan. They've already seen that. So that is the most likely pathway it's going to happen in my view. Correct, there was another question I may not have answered. Just ask me again. Is there anything I've not answered?
No, I think these aspects have been addressed, but if there is any, I'll come back to you again, sir. So going to Dr. Rabia, the question by Coordinator Farouk, who also happens to be my student, so I'm promoting my students today. This is while it is expected that USA will continue cooperating with India on strategic and economic issues, how she looks at Biden's role as regards human rights violations in Kashmir. Secondly, how effectively can Pakistan convince United States that its support to India against China will be more utilized against Pakistan? So while Rabia, you answered that, I would also appreciate this, but you can comment on this. The apprehensions in Pakistan that the United States doesn't care for the ongoing human rights violations in Kashmir. So if you have comments to that also. And there are a couple of questions which are interrelated about, again, Afghanistan. If you could, once you have the opportunity, if you can address those. It's about the ownership of Afghan peace process by Biden administration. Will it own or not? So one or two other questions, they're also related to Afghanistan. So maybe if you can address those in your comments also. Rabia, to you.
Okay, thank you so much for the questions, Coronel Leader Farouk. I think so the ray of hope for the Kashmiris and for human rights champions around the world is with the end of the Trump administration. And we have seen, statements that have come out by the now Vice President-elect Kamala Harris, who was on record saying that, if the situation demands, they would intervene in J&K. So I think there is some hope, some optimism that one needs to hold on to. And in Biden, he had earlier written an article in Foreign Affairs, and he was very um, wary of the populists and the demagogues. And I think after having lived in America under Trump, and after having seen how he was able to divide the American nation, uh, I think there is hope that Biden and his administration would be more sympathetic towards how Modi is running, his show in India, and he seems to be the embodiment of right-wing populism that Biden stands against. So there could be hope, but while we could be hopeful that Pakistan should engage Biden administration on these issues because of their experience of the past 4 years, so they'll be more open to, you know, championing the cause of human rights across the globe. Uh, we don't also want this optimism to be misplaced. Um, like I'd earlier answered, one question by Mozum, US is going to be bogged down domestically, and that's a reality. So to think that immediately Kashmir will be on Biden administration's radar would be a case of misplaced optimism. So I think while Pakistan should pursue that agenda with the incoming administration, Pakistan should not have too much hope, and the Kashmiris should not have too much hope that this would be readily absorbed and taken up as an agenda. I think there'll be a time for it, but Pakistan needs to start the work now, but also not be too hopeful that something will happen in a jiffy, because it won't. As to answer his second part of his question, so we have been there before. In 65 war, both sides used weapons that were supplied to both India and Pakistan for different reasons. And yet they were used against each other, and that's what led to the arms embargo. And so this time too, I've been saying and I've been writing that United States need to understand that it cannot talk about peace and stability in the region while it continues to feed the drivers of instability in the region through sale of offensive arms to India. And even if India is using its China card to secure and modernize its military, uh, the battleground against which India is going to test all these new toys is going to be against Pakistan. There's absolutely no doubt about it, and the world has seen India's resolvent capability or the lack of it against China. So I think that case is pretty much clear. But US has its own compulsions. I don't think that US will change its policies or make its policies, just to please Pakistan. But it should not stop Pakistan from continuing to make and take this line that US is reinforcing security dilemma in the region by fueling this arms race and competition in our region. Thank you.
Yeah, Elizabeth, over to you.
All right, thanks very much. Briefly, just a couple of points in response to that overarching question, and then I'm happy to address anything specifically on Afghanistan, but I'm not sure precisely what the Afghan questions are. I would really echo what Brigadier Feroz said about the importance of both Track 1 and Track 2 dialogues for working out some of these issues. In terms of this question of U.S. providing arms to India, I think one question that I have that I haven't seen covered in a great deal of depth is the extent to which Pakistan shares those sensitivities about the armaments that Russia is providing India, which in terms of the conventional balance could actually be more decisive, right? You look at the S-400, you look at BrahMos, you look at the Su-30s, those are significant potential game changers. And while the US certainly is playing a role in trying to strengthen India with regards to its overall competition with China, it's not the only player that is taking those steps. And so I do wonder how the broader regional picture fits into that, and whether Pakistan shares those sensitivities with regards to Russian arms. On the human rights question, I thought Ijaz Haider made a good point in a piece that he had written for Dawn a couple of days ago, that while there might overall be a greater focus on human rights, potentially in Kashmir, potentially just in general with the Modi administration's policies, Pakistan also will likely find itself subject to similar concerns in terms of treatment of minority communities, religious freedom issues, controls over the press. And so that is a two-way street to a certain extent, and I think it's important to recognize both sides of that equation. Happy to answer anything specifically on Afghanistan. I'm not sure what the actual question is.
There are a couple of comments. It's mainly about the ownership of one peace process or Doha deal by the Biden administration, which has come under discussion. But these questions were raised by a couple of people about on Afghanistan. So, if you want to address, or we can move forward.
Sure. In terms of ownership, I think it's an interesting way of phrasing it, right? Because the U.S. was directly talking with the Taliban and had an agreement that came out in February of this year. And right now, this is, at least in theory, the intra-Afghan process. This is a process that, while the U.S. is certainly a player, given the presence of troops in Afghanistan and kind of the role that the U.S. has played as a facilitator, ultimately, at the end of the day, it is the Afghan party sitting across from each other at the table. And I think that is a delicate position for the U.S. to try to manage. But it's also one that, if it succeeds, is likely to be more sustainable than a process that is directly owned by the U.S. administration. For example, these are long-standing issues, but at the heart of the Afghan conflict is a political question. And so having the space, having the patience for both sides to engage on those issues, those really fundamental issues that are at the heart of the conflict in Afghanistan, this is the best opportunity that we have seen in the past 19 years to work out some of those fundamental questions that have been driving instability in Afghanistan for 40 years. And so it's not surprising to my mind that it has taken this long and that momentum looks slow at the moment. But I think going forward, the challenge for the Biden administration is going to be to recognize that the U.S. is an actor in this situation, given the troops, given just its presence in the region and influence with both sides. But it's not a decisive player. And so it will continue to take, for example, the support and assistance of regional governments like Pakistan to continue to build momentum. It's not just the U.S. that will be involved in this process. And primarily, it is both the Afghan sides.
Thank you, Elizabeth. A final question to Dr. Rabia. This is a question about how Europe will see new administration. Will there be trust or not? Or it would be... Will this shift be lasting or merely a lapse of America's foreign policy? The question is all about the distrust which has been created amongst several European countries that the United States is no more a reliable partner. So how will it change under the Biden administration? And there's also a question by a young participant. She said that the US has been aiming towards full spectrum dominance. The full spectrum is a catchy word these days. So the United States had been following this full spectrum dominance, and would it still be able to achieve it after the post-election scenario in the face of China's rise? Maybe if you can lump these two questions and address these. Thank you.
Thank you so much. With respect to Europe, I think enough damage has been done in these past 4 years, and I think it would be right on top of Biden's priority agenda in order to bridge that trust gap that has now come between U.S. and its allies. So there's just no question about it. But both, as to how it settles the domestic affairs at home, and internationally as to how it brings or wins back its allies. I think, all around the world, not only the Americans, but all around the globe, everybody had been watching this election, with, literally holding their hearts in their hands. And I think US allies in Europe are deeply relieved that now some semblance of what they knew to be normal is going to make a comeback. With respect to full spectrum dominance, I don't think that US is ever going to lose that edge. Like my fellow panelists have also stated, US military is right out there on the top. US is still the superpower despite the kind of trade wars it is having with China and the kind of capacity that China is developing to upset US in the economic realm. Militarily, US is still right on the top, and I don't see any country coming near and destabilizing or taking that full spectrum dominance away from the US. So I think it is there to last. It's just that, let's see as to how Biden administration prioritizes. So I think domestic and then international winning of allies, and then obviously, bringing troops back home. I hope that stride continues, and that would be a sigh of relief for a lot of countries around the globe. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Abhay. Last set of questions directed towards Firoz Hassan Khan before I request the chair of the session for his views on these issues. The question is by Dr. Mansoor Khan. Do you think that if the United States goes for a significant or total withdrawal of troops, it will compensate heavily with drone warfare due to the massive impact of the US military industrial complex on US foreign policy? And another question, which is also related to arms control, it's raised by Sara Nazir. She says that in terms of space-based weapons, once British Ministry of Defence said that the economies are becoming dependent on space-based systems, and by 2050, space-based weapons may also be deployed, including the nuclear weapons. What do you think about using the space-based weapons and the destruction caused by them, and what will be the future of arms control treaties? And another related question, the future of PPWT and PAROS, which are under CD, discussion at the CD. So if you would like to briefly mention, that question was raised by Ms. Munazza. Sir, over to you. So Mike, your mic.
Get the first question again. What was that withdrawal related to military industrial complex? Could you repeat that question for me? You break.
Dr. Mansoor said, do you think that if the United States goes for a significant or total withdrawal of troops, it will compensate heavily with drone warfare due to the massive impact of US military industrial complex on US foreign policy? Essentially meaning if there are no boots on ground, the drones would still be there because of the interest of the US military industrial complex. So that's the question.
Well, I don't know about the industrial complex element, but yes, the answer that the high-tech war based on UAVs, etc., is the new fashionable thing everywhere. I mean, it's not just that the US is doing that. Take, for example, even these militias are using in Turkey and other Kurds and other areas as well. So yes, so most likely that is the direction in which the technological evolution and the industrial complex is moving in, if that is what the question really means. So the answer is yes, the old-fashioned war, boots on ground, etc. And this is what is being talked about, the changed character of warfare in today's time, sometimes also referred to as fifth generation, sixth generation, or there's so many names being given here. Even if we talk about our own region in South Asia, now I'm going to say something which might surprise people, but actually this is just an observation. The idea of cold start doctrine and the tactical nuclear weapons replacing them eventually has come and gone as we speak now, because there are so much of technological evolution that already happened that future crisis is not going to happen. Why do you waste so much of time and energy? Because the downside risks are so greater in these issues. Therefore, that's the way the warfare is going to go. Cyber, UAV, precision guided munitions. standoff weapons, hypersonics. These are the areas which are on the these are the trend lines in technological terms going. So similarly, the question about space. Similarly, that tremendous amount of activities are going on the space side. But I'm answering the question about Paros and space together because that is exactly where the problem is. The whole idea of outer space negotiation, which has never started, essentially was to prevent from space-based weapon being placed there. But you can see there were so many activities going on. The hitting at satellite and anti-satellite ASAT. You know what's going on there on that side. So uh, 2050 is a way far off. We're talking about 4 or 5 years from now. But even if there is a agreement of some kind of a discussion at the forum, at CD forum, on outer space discussion, that will be a big breakthrough. At least I've been hearing this for last 30 years and nothing has happened on that side. So for that discussion, I think it is Russia, China, and United States that they are the leaders in these three areas to begin with in that discussion, if at all. Pharaohs have to start. So smaller actors are not there. So my answer to those to both questions are yes. I mean, these are the trend lines.
Sir, thank you very much. And finally, sir, I would request Chair of the session, Air Marshal Javed Ahmed. I know he has many interesting thoughts about these issues, but because we had been discussing these issues once you were there at the Center for Aerospace and Security Studies, and heading this university also, he also has a vision to work on many of these issues. Sir, I know it's very difficult to be patiently hearing all these speakers and not being able to speak for such a long time, but all is yours now, sir.
Adil, thank you very much. I think this session has been very exhaustive. I would personally like to thank each one of you, Elizabeth and Dr. Feroz on the other side of the world, Dr. Rabia in Islamabad, and Dr. Nazir. I think it was a very interesting topic, discussed threadbare, and most of the points which I had noted are already covered. But I would just like to talk of few dimensions. I would agree with Dr. Rabia once she said that, uh, it's a very unstable region. And if we talk of what really happens and how Pakistan views these changes, we very nearly came to war last year with India. I think most of the aspects have been downplayed, but in February it was very close to a all-out conflict, and this continues in Pakistan almost on daily basis. We don't discuss line of control. Sometimes it has become a thing which is, let's say, it is being treated as a new norm, which it is not. It's a very volatile situation. And if you couple this with the government in India and the hard line of stance which they have taken against the Muslims in general, I think it's a very tough call for Pakistan. So from that perspective, Pakistan looks at the US to play a stabilizing role in the region, not to take sides, which I know will be very difficult. If you play that China card and you start to counterweight and counterbalance, I think this is a very tough call. For Elizabeth, I think she covered the aspect of uncertainty. That is very important if you talk of the Afghan situation. We are all familiar with the Afghan history. For the last 4 or 5 decades, whole generations have grown up in a region which is absolutely different than the rest of the world. And because she understands Pashto, she must be very familiar with the Afghan culture. I think the situation for Afghanistan the future doesn't bode very well, irrespective of which government comes in. It's been an area laid barren by war for the last so many years, and the enmities run deep. I think if there's a problem, we may head for some serious issues. You can't grudge Pakistan for building that fence all along and trying to protect whatever we could. Pakistan also has been through very tough terrorism issues in the last 2 decades, and it's taken a lot of heavy toll, something which we did not figure out in the talk today. But Pakistan has taken a heavy toll, whether it is economically or in terms of lives, where Afghanistan is concerned. Dr. Nazir was very right once he said that the change will be continuity and change. It will not be a 360 degrees for the new government. Uh, I would take this at, I think, if you look at uh, Mr. Biden as somebody who's very, very experienced, I think he has a historic opportunity to set things right. Not view it from the prism of the policies which have laid waste the region from Afghanistan all the way to Libya, but he has a chance to maybe look in a new way at the challenges which face the world and take up that leadership role which somehow for the US has been dwindling in the last 4 or 5 years. You may think of environment, you may talk of how each one of us needs to cooperate on the COVID challenge which has come up. So I would say that the challenge for the uh, Biden government is, besides the internal element, is to take up that leadership role in a very positive manner and not to get carried away by the military industrial complex, which I don't know how it will survive without any wars for the last 4 years, or if you look at the future. Uh, so I think that is probably a bigger challenge for the US to do it right this time and not get involved and embroiled the way they have been for the last, I think, 2 decades. Brigadier Feroz was very right that it's a multipolar world. It is very difficult to limit technology the way it is going right now. And you can take the example of the lethal autonomous weapons which have come in. I think the attack on the Saudi oil fields was one example on how easily it is to disrupt life by weapons which are there these days. Lastly, I would like to say that in terms of opportunities, we must give this new administration a chance to look at the new perspective. And if I talk from the education field, I think Pakistan has a lot of cooperation avenues with the US, whether it is Pakistan, US uh, academic corridor or the Fulbright scholarships which were happening. Pakistan should keenly look up at cooperation in areas which transcend beyond the military element and go more toward the civil and the development areas. So I would end on this note by thanking each one of you once again for educating us uh, in a very professional manner and bringing up the issues which I think would make Adil and his team write some very good reports after this, which I would keenly look forward to. And Adil, thank you very much for hosting this for everybody. Thank you very much once again.
Sir, thank you very much for being there and for your remarks. And thank you to all the panelists for taking time out and discussing these issues, which are very important. Thank you very much, and Khuda Hafiz and bye-bye.
Thank you so much, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.